It's critical to always be learning. I think from an entrepreneurial standpoint, you've heard this from a lot of successful entrepreneurs, you need to have that balance, ego and confidence, but you also need to be willing to be flexible and understand where you may be wrong and you may need to pivot. I learned a ton about just the value you get from having to make those cold calls and having to be hung up on and just that emotional kind of tough skin that you build. But time is your most important asset in general, and definitely in search, definitely as a self-funded searcher, because
how would you describe your last 5 years professionally?
my background is sales and operations, entrepreneurship, and then strategy is kind of my skill set and my background over the past 5 years. From a sales and operational standpoint, I'm now a partner at a healthcare real estate brokerage where I led strategy, operations, and sales, and ended up growing the company's revenue to roughly 200% within the first 2 years. So that ended up being a really successful operation for me. And I've since transitioned to search, what I'm doing now. But from an entrepreneurial standpoint, I founded the Clean Z Sponge, which is a consumer product. It's sold in all 50 states. It's also sold in 4 other countries. So I've had experience patenting. I patented the product, so I have a utility patent for that product. And I have experience branding. I wrote the initial utility patent and had an attorney sort of transition and shipped it so that a lot of my bases were covered, but I learned about sourcing from out of the country, that sort of thing. And then from kind of a strategy standpoint, I was lucky early on in my career to have worked at 2 large firms. I worked at Target Corporation and Amazon, where I was in more data analytics roles. And what that allowed me to do was it allowed me to really leverage data to really create a roadmap toward where I want to be. And then because I have a background in business development and sales, outbound sales and inbound sales, I'm kind of able to test my strategies pretty robustly by actually going out and making the calls or talking to people. And I'm able to leverage data to do that. And that's really served me well throughout my career.
That's an interesting kind of trajectory you painted there. Basically, it seems like you make a difference in whatever you choose to do. I mean, you have a patent pending on this product that you developed. You increase revenue or sales by 2x in your first couple of years, and you're learning new skills constantly, such as data analysis. I'm curious, how is that reflexively? Do you test your own skill development and see what's the ROI on my time?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's critical to always be learning. I think from an entrepreneurial standpoint, you've heard this from a lot of successful entrepreneurs, you need to have that balance, ego and confidence, but you also need to be willing to be flexible and understand where you may be wrong and you may need to pivot. So I think it's important for me to constantly be in touch with the people that have done it before me and understand what mistakes they've made, what strategies they've used. And I think each individual is very different, so they bring a new lens to things. So it's not about necessarily copying what someone's done, but it's using your unique skill set to sort of merge into what's already been done. And I think that creates kind of a unique combination of things and a unique way of thinking that can ultimately be successful. And with entrepreneurship, there's no guarantee that's part of it. But what you want to do is put your hat in the rake and you want to give yourself the best probability of success. So that's kind of how I've navigated it, with the understanding that things can go sideways. I've learned throughout my experience at the healthcare real estate company, I've learned you have to have tough skin and things can go awry. But ideally you hedge your risk as much as you can and you kind of give yourself as many at-bats as possible.
Yeah. That's very true, I think. you mentioned learning from people that have gone before you. Could you give like one or two examples of people's stories that resonate with you or that were inspiring?
Yeah, I think some of the people that have been influential for me have been people like Charlie Munger. I like a lot of his theories. He's a very practical person who has been incredibly successful in the investment realm of things. So I really like his way of thinking, the way that the things that he talks about are really very simple concepts, but they're really hard to sort of apply in today's society of just like hustle and bustle, continue to change this and change that. He's essentially saying, look at what people have done before you, look at how they've failed, and essentially avoid those things. They're very simple concepts like that have really helped him and Warren Buffett accumulate a lot of the wealth and success that they've had. And then they say things like, don't work with jerks, things like that help your just overall well-being, in order to be creative and to be as disciplined in doing just the simple things. I think those things like health and working with the right people are important, right? You can't always control all of the factors, but the things you can control, you should really double down on. And I think one of the big focuses is controlling the controllables. Is as simple as it is. It's really important to understand in entrepreneurship because there's really no parameters to anything outside of what you've created. So you need to understand what you can control and do your best in that area. So I really like Charlie Munger from kind of a practical standpoint. And then I also I've used Ray Dalio's influence. He's a very practical, strategic thinker. He's helped me think about things a little differently. One of the concepts that he has is he has this 5-step process that he mentions in his book, Principles, which is, you can think of it as, let's say you have a large machine with many different gears, which is your business or whatever you're going after. And when you zoom out of that machine, you see there's all these gears, there's small gears, there's medium size, there's large gears. And you have to sometimes, in order to direct that machine in the way you want it to go, you have to zoom in to these gears to see some are in well working order, some are in okay order, some are really bad. And if you have one of those large gears that's really bad, you need to zoom in to see what's going on with that gear before you can lead the entire machine. So the whole concept is about, where do I want to be? It's about setting a goal and then saying, what needs to be done in order to achieve that goal? And it's about breaking it down each step of the way to where you eventually have an executable plan. So I take that concept and apply it to a lot of the things that I'm trying to pursue, because it allows me to ask the right questions in order to create a little more structure around what I'm doing and trying to accomplish. And then lastly, I'd say from a creativity standpoint, I like reading about, I'm trying to think of who, there's the tech entrepreneur aspect of me, the Silicon Valley aspect of me that's less practical, more creative in terms of just thinking differently. So I really enjoy like the Google founders and people who created brand new industries and just thought about how humans do things differently. Uber's founder, like people who are really changing the landscape within human behavior and creating a ton of value and creating these new industries is really, really interesting to me. And that was kind of the impetus, as strange as it may be, for the reusable bottle sponge product, which the Cleansy sponge, which I created. It was a new way of cleaning a bottle. And I really like that concept. I like applying those new concepts to sort of outdated industries. And it's just interesting to me. So I think that kind of confluence of people is has helped shape who I am, at least as an entrepreneur and really as a person.
Thanks for sharing that. That was really fascinating to hear the breakdown from Charlie Munger and Ray Dalio, and then some of the tech founders, like you say, inventing new industries, like ripping a hole in space-time and like channeling in a different portal. I do find it interesting that you have that creativity, that drive, but then you want to apply it to an existing industry, if I understand you correctly, with acquisition entrepreneurship. Could you help me understand why? I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong, of course, but some people, they go the full startup route, making their own industry, and you want to kind of take some of that innovation that goes with invention and apply it to an existing industry, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I think the impetus for that has been I started out thinking startup entrepreneurship was the only way. That's the only way to be an entrepreneur. And I slowly realized that wasn't the only way. And really, I realized through reading Walker Deibel's Buy Then Build is the book that sort of opened my eyes to the M&A world. I genuinely did not understand that world. It just wasn't a part of my experience. So startups were very risky. I didn't necessarily have the resources to go all in on a particular idea that may not have made money for the first 2 years. I had successfully been at companies previously and had grown their, top and bottom lines. And I wanted to capture that upside of doing that. And after reading that book, it opened my eyes to a new world of being able to apply my creativity and still have that entrepreneurial spirit to something that already has legs, and I can strengthen those legs quite significantly for the right business. So to me, that was a big eye-opener in terms of just, I read Charlie Munger and Ray Dalio. They talk about, hedging risk and having a margin for error. I thought that was a great way to sort of apply both to a company. So really what ended up happening was I read the Walker Deibel Build. That opened my mind to this world, and I got introduced to Search Funder and introduced to these other platforms that were just sharing SMB Twitter, sharing more information about the M&A process. And then I got a hold of every book that I could on M&A law, on strategy and operation, accounting, just the process of buying a business and successfully running and operating it. So I then set out on a journey to go do that. I felt like that was a calling of mine. And it's been now, 12 months of looking for the right business. I think it's really important to make sure you're mapping what's personally interesting to you with a really good business model. And it took some time to get to that. I thought at first one example is I thought funeral services, that it just makes sense. The baby boomer population is aging, and there's going to need to be more services in that space. And a lot of the funeral homes that I've been to have been a little outdated in their processes, and maybe I can bring some creativity there. And yeah, I think the thesis may be there in some senses, but I thought, this doesn't really pull you, or this isn't really exciting to you. So you need to take some time to think a little more about what really pulls you and what could you see yourself doing for the next 20 to 30 years. So that really challenged me, and I've since at least landed on a few different industries.
Well, I'd love to walk through that journey with you, but I just want to go back and mention you're one of the more avid readers that I know. Do you try to read a book a week?
I wish I had that kind of time. No, what I do is I feel like this was a hack of mine that maybe people already know about it, but I think doing all of your creative work early in the morning is like a secret weapon, because your brain can retain so much more information early in the morning. So I feel like I optimize I work out in the morning and then I read. What I try to do is And I don't want to make it more, I know reading should be leisurely sometimes, but I look at how many pages of this book I want to read. I look at how many pages it is roughly, and then I figure out, okay, what's a reasonable amount to read in the morning? Oh, I can get 10 pages in. Okay, if I can get 10 pages in, and the book's 300 pages, it'll take me 30 days to read that book if I read my 10 pages each day, which is pretty reasonable. So it allows me to not worry too much about, oh, well, I have this book to finish or I have that book to finish. And all of a sudden, if you stay consistent, you end up reading quite a bit. And then on the weekends, I usually allow myself to read a little more. So you can cut that time down a bit. So it's just helped me kind of read more and then be okay with reading 10 pages and kind of setting the book down. And it's allowed me to explore different types of books. So I'll switch throughout, and I usually end up reading quite a bit because of that.
I think it might help with changing perspectives too, because you mentioned earlier about learning from others, and if you can, some of these greats, they were able to learn from others' mistakes so they didn't have to repeat them. But I think the missing piece there is kind of self-awareness. Sometimes it feels like, what, I'm doing everything right and I'm just not getting the results John is getting. It's like, well, did you truly understand what he was doing or why that didn't work or why that did work? So I think that perhaps reading can open your mind in new ways as well, and help you use your instruments to a better ability. When you mentioned that your partner at a healthcare real estate company, that's significant. That's a good place to be career-wise, and yet you want to pivot into a different industry, into a different role, and be CEO of a small to medium-sized business. Could you talk about the decision-making between leaving, I assume, a hard-won position and going out into the somewhat of a frontier?
Yeah, it's a good question. I get asked that a lot. And I think the most important thing for me in terms of this transition was, one, I've always wanted to kind of own my own company and grow an employee base that's filled with a culture that I've always wanted. So that was really important to me. And I think with the healthcare real estate side of things and all maybe previous roles, I've come into companies and I've helped grow them quite a bit. And I've wanted to, when you do that, you're not the owner of the company. You're an employee, and I do own a portion of the company, a small portion. But ultimately, I'm not the owner. I'm not necessarily guiding culture. I am, in a sense, I have a say in what goes on there, but I've just always wanted to kind of have my own baby, which I do with my sponge company, but at the same time, it's not an employee company. It's a small consumer product company. So a lot of my transition had to do with me wanting to challenge myself as well in terms of, hey, you've gone to these companies that already, are operating, even though some are barely operating. You've gone to these companies, you've helped improve them over time, and then you're kind of just there. But the upside is capped, and a lot of the upside's capped to what the owners are willing to take on or what the owners are willing to do from a risk perspective. So for me, I wanted to own my own company. I wanted to apply a lot of the strategy that I've learned without a capped upside. And I wanted to, if I was going to take on partners, I wanted to be able to have that choice and decision to make sure the partners that I was taking on were a good match and a good match for where I may be weak. So I kind of wanted a semi-clear canvas to really go all in on something without having to deal with kind of the political side of things and deal with partners that may not be a great fit for me personally.
So this is where I think a lot of people would resonate. Mid-career pivoters, recent business school graduates alike. What does it look like? You decide, you can punch your own ticket to a large extent, and yet here you are choosing to acquire another company, regionally focused, industry somewhat agnostic. We can drill into that a little bit later if you like. But what does it look like when you make that decision? What's a full-time like acquisition look like, or deal sourcing rather?
So luckily, what I'll say is, transitioning, I had done a transition like this before transitioning into full-time searching for a business to acquire. But let me shed a little light on what that looked like. So I left a large company where I was in a more analytical role. It was high paying, totally fine, big company. And I left that job to go into helping this healthcare real estate company grow. And that was 100% commission role. So there was no salary involved with that whatsoever. So that was a scary transition. And that transition, it took about a little over a year of seeing my savings go down to nearly zero, to making more money than I've made in any of my corporate jobs. But that transition was emotionally, that was a roller coaster, right? You get excited about deals and then the deals fall through. You get excited, it falls through. You learn so much about yourself because I was leading the business development and sales efforts. So I was doing a lot of the cold calling, talking to these physician partnerships. And a lot of that, there's a lot of emotion involved because you have to build tough skin. You might get cursed out on the phone by a physician. You know, they may hang up on you. People may say, "Why? What are you calling me for?" All of those things happen, and you're not used to that in these very structured corporate environments. You don't have to deal with those things, and you're selling yourself. So I learned a ton about just the value you get from having to make those cold calls and having to be hung up on, and just that emotional kind of tough skin that you build. So I did that. I saw what that yielded, right? From going from an introduction on the phone all the way to closing a large healthcare transaction, the closing of a surgery center, a medical office building. And having led that process from beginning to end, that it just takes you through so much emotionally. And I think seeing the successful side of that and having gone through the process of being the one that built out the strategy for that, it helps give me the comfort and understanding that, you know, there are some variables I can control that at least have a higher probability of achieving success here. So that's what a lot of that reading was for. Kind of when I became partner, I transitioned to learning more about that SMB world so I could understand how I need to shape my strategy and control the controllable. So now fast forward to me transitioning to full-time search, I got enough comfort to the point where I actually felt like, okay, I know enough of the variables now that I can go out and speak competently to these business acquisitions. I can speak to the bankers. I can speak to the accountants. I can speak to the business owners. I can speak to investors about what I like about these businesses and really understand and talk the talk. So that's all that I needed, right? I think there's an important piece to all of this, which is you can get caught up in the reading and analyzing all day because there's so much more to know. Like, don't get me wrong, there's so much more to know, but there's nothing better than trial and error. You know, you have to drink from the fire hose sometimes, and it's not fun. Don't get me wrong, drinking from the fire hose is not fun, but it's absolutely necessary in these cases. So I think, you know, now that I'm full-time, I've done a bunch of cold calls. I've met with business owners face to face, and I've really gotten a feel for what I do and don't like. So it's been a great journey. I think I've learned so much more about myself. I've learned a lot more about the businesses that I actually want to be in by going out and visiting the businesses and talking to the owners.
Yeah, that sounds really important. Can you talk about narrowing down your criteria? So for example, there's region, there's industry, there's size, there's whether to partner or go solo, there's whether to be traditional or self-funded, there's a few variables just to begin with. Could you talk about your decision making around those variables?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of variables to think about. And I think for me, this was part of the kind of research project before diving deeply into it. So some of the variables I thought about were, self-funded, traditional, accelerator, and then also industry. So I spent a lot of time just talking to people who had done it, operators, as well as certainly just people who are currently searching and understanding how they were thinking about these things to get a better understanding of what's important and what matters to me. So I'm a self-funded full-time searcher. It was really important to be self-funded just because of my personal journey. It was important for me to be able to have the control the ship, to also have the responsibility to take that on. And whether it's successful or a massive failure was going to be on me. And that was important to me. And a lot of it is because I've always been an entrepreneur at heart. And it's been really important for me to figure out what does that look like for me. And I've spent a lot of my career trying to figure that out. I've been at large corporate jobs and haven't liked the politics. I've joined partnerships and have felt like our potential has been capped and I couldn't do anything about it because I wasn't the owner of the company. So I thought, I want to give myself a true shot at owning the company, taking on the risk, and being responsible for its success or its failure. So that's why I ended up going self-funded. The next step was, okay, well, if you're going to go self-funded, you're going to need to have some fun. And it took a while to understand that and grasp my head around, an SBA loan and, the idea of being able to put 10% equity down on an SBA loan and still make a sizable acquisition. And, it took time and talking to people to understand that that may not be the best way to finance a transaction. And, just because you can doesn't mean you should. You should have the right balance of equity and debt in an acquisition. So it was all of those things that ultimately led me to pursue a self-funded full-time search. And then from a full-time standpoint, because a lot of people will say, you can just do part-time. I think full-time is really important because you need to be able to go all in on making these calls and going and visiting and talking to these owners. You also need to continue to stay knowledgeable in the different industries. And depending on what your W-2 job is, you may not have that time. You also only have so much mind space. And that's a real thing that I think people kind of talk about it as if your brain space is just its capacity is equal throughout the day. You lose capacity, right? Like over time. So, that's why I said what I said about the morning. So I think that's why the full-time can become really powerful. If you have a W-2 job where you're genuinely not using any brain space and you just have a ton of free time, for sure. That's probably
Also, tell me which W-2 job you have. I'm signing up.
Yeah, some people have said that, they have plenty of time. So yeah, I think those things sort of led me to choose a self-funded full-time search.
Even with self-funded, though, sometimes people join accelerators. What are you doing to kind of illuminate those blind spots, have that accountability, kind of like a peer group nature? Or do you have mentors, advisors, like in a structured kind of arrangement as you're navigating this adventure?
Yeah, I have a semi-informal peer group that we pop into I think it's every month or so. And then I join, I've joined an accelerator. I joined Karen Spencer's accelerator just to kind of learn more about the search landscape. And then in terms of accountability, I have a few individual searchers that I have just probably, I guess, 3 times a week check-in just to understand what's going on in their journey, what's been working, what hasn't been working. And then I have my own, that sort of strategic 5-step process that I mentioned with Ray Dalio. That is what I hold myself accountable to, which is sort of, what's your long-term goal? What do you want to accomplish? Oh, you want to buy a business by X date. And then it's backing into, what does that look like from a daily executional standpoint? And how many leads do you need to have sort of active? How many people do you need to have interested in order to potentially even get to that? So that's kind of my day-to-day item that holds me accountable. And then I structure my schedule kind of around that. So I say, okay, if those things are going on and I've got a funnel of leads that are going into that, as long as I'm keeping that right, I can then focus. And this is kind of more, a lot of it is structured around proprietary, like cold outreach. And then I can focus on the broker relationship side of things. I can focus on learning more about the industry so I can personalize my messages better. And I can also just look on market, like on the marketplaces for deals as well. So I'm hitting it from different angles so that I'm, again, giving myself the most at-bats, the highest probability of closing on a business. So that, I feel like that has helped me. It's the same thing I did at the healthcare real estate firm.
Yeah, it seems like very much like a sales approach, which I think is apt. I mean, business search can certainly be thought of in a similar way. But let's talk about the region. You're all in on a particular state. Could you talk about your decision-making there?
Yeah. So all in on California. A lot of it is personal, to be honest. I used to live in the Bay Area. I lived in Burlingame, California, beautiful area. So the South Bay. And I felt the most alive when I was there, honestly. And I had the most energy. I loved being outdoors. I love being active and working out. It's a great place to do that. Wonderful weather. And I felt the best. I felt the most alive. And I feel like, me and my long-term partner, my long-term girlfriend, we're at the age where we're looking to start a family and really set roots somewhere. And we just decided that this makes a lot of sense. California is also a big market. There's a lot of pushback, obviously, I've gotten just from a political and regulatory standpoint. California, having all of these like anti-business practices, which there's definitely truth to a lot of that, but California is still a very large market. There's still plenty of business owners that are making it happen there, yet it may be more difficult to run and operate a business there. And I understand that risk for the time being. But ultimately it's a large market where people are going to continue to frequent.
Yeah. Well, like you talked about with choosing an industry that you're passionate about, can show up to work with bigger and want to go to work. Similarly, your environment can incentivize or disincentivize your kind of mind space around the culture that you want to make. So I think that those trade-offs make sense.
Yeah, and one other thing is, I think what's really important, especially in the SMB community, is building community. So I think, leveraging your community where you plan to be, creating a wonderful environment in that community. And I think that's why it's really important for me to acquire a business there, because I love it there. And I think that will come out in the business practices too. I think in terms of just being able to sponsor events or create opportunities for people to have a good time or enjoy themselves, or to create those moments for people is just really important to me. And I think to create it within your own community is awesome.
Yeah. Let's talk about theory versus reality. You mentioned you've been in California, so you've vetted it personally, but also with businesses or industries, it might look like one thing, and then in person or after a certain event show a different side of things. How has that played out for you, and how have you navigated that transition from thinking something's one way to seeing it in a different way and upgrading your decision making?
That's been a really interesting part of the journey too. I think it still happens. I think you have to sort of assume certain things, especially if your background's more of kind of a generalist background. For me, it's been talking to the owners, and people have mentioned this in the community as well. I think it's so important to talk to people with real-time experience in that particular field. I think for me, it was, reading industry reports it's something, but it's still very theoretical. I think it's more impactful to understand just general, maybe micro, I guess you could call it microeconomic themes. What do people like? What do people gravitate toward? How frequently do they gravitate toward it? And, whether it's people or businesses, and then really understanding how large is that market? What does it look like? Are there mom and pop shops, or is it highly dominated by one individual? Like, just understanding those general themes, I think, is really important. And then understanding kind of what do these business owners, what does the day-to-day look like for a lot of these business owners? And how do things work? How do they get business? What are their processes? What are the employees like? Do they enjoy their jobs, or is it kind of a horrible experience? I'll give you an example of one of the industries I was looking at was the restoration industry. So, people who come in if there's a fire, or there's a flood in a business, or in a home. So, or if there's mold everywhere and it has to be remediation of the mold. I looked at that business and I thought, yeah, there's a lot of fires in the Bay Area. Like, these businesses, there's old infrastructure. It makes a lot of sense. These businesses, are probably need these services. And this was true. I went and talked to an owner. He said, yeah, we're pretty busy, we've always got work, but he's like, remember, you're dealing with people at their worst time. Like, when things are going awry, you can't really be thinking about payment or anything like that. How is this going to be processed? You are just damage control, disaster control right away. And you're always in that, and you're open 24/7 for these hyper emergencies. So he's like, it takes a huge toll on you. And then it's really hard, laborious work for your employees. So things like that are things I didn't think about. I didn't think about what that would look like. I was just thinking, oh, this could be an interesting industry because there's going to be consistent demand, right? So I think it's really important to talk to an owner, make sure it makes sense for your lifestyle and what you're looking for. And so that was one of the industries. I talked to an owner about the party rental industry. I thought, oh, this is an interesting industry. You can rent these, tents and chairs and blah, blah, blah. Very simple operation. And it was just interesting learning more about their process and how, if you're not always there and the person who's running the business owns all of the relationships, they typically branch off and just start their own business. So you kind of need to be there all the time. So when you think about scalability and you think about what that looks like when you really significantly grow, it was an interesting concept that I had never thought of. So what I learned from all of that was, if you're thinking about an industry, try to talk to people that are in that industry, and also try to think through those components that aren't, you naturally, your bias gravitates toward why that industry is great, but think through the components that actually may not be thought about. How are they estimating these jobs? Is it difficult to estimate these jobs? And are people excited about what they're doing?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop when you mentioned the party rental service. I thought they were going to say like, oh, it's a nightmare, but you're just like, you have to be there because otherwise you're basically giving people business, but you're not necessarily having return customers. Could you talk about having too narrow of an industry search?
Yeah. So I started out very narrow because again, this is the conflicting information that's on in the search world. And some people say, be general. Some people say hone into a particular industry. The verdict's still out. But I started off narrow, and I did a lot of thinking about this. And so I started off in the water management industry is what I labeled it. So this was anything water conservation, stormwater capture, water treatment related. I thought, West Coast is a desert, like water is an issue. There's outdated. I started learning about how our infrastructure is so outdated. I learned about just the frequency of droughts, especially in California in particular, although they recently got plenty of rainfall. And then I learned that, 80% of their water is used for irrigation in the agricultural industry. And that's a large portion of their economy. So water in general is just, the cost is going to continue to go up. So anything related to kind of whether it's efficiently transporting water or it's treating water in a particular way is going to be a lucrative business. I still believe that that's a great thesis. But for search and for full-time search, it was too narrow of a thesis. There's only so many businesses that fit the right profile, that have, baby boomer owners that are willing and ready to sell. So I had to broaden I realized that, and there's not like brokers that are water broker, business brokers. It's just too narrow of a category. There's business brokers that I've talked to that have sold water related businesses. But I couldn't lead on that. So what I learned from that was, let's not dive into just one particular industry and just focus on that. Let's figure out what characteristics of these businesses are both personal fit and also like a really good business fit in terms of where I want to be in 10 to 20 years. So a lot of that landed on, I wanted niche B2B services. I wanted a business that had relatively simple operations, so no highly technical knowledge. And then 4, I wanted relationships to matter. I wanted it to not be a completely commoditized business where it's just kind of like your cable companies, right? I just switched companies because I got some mailer that said they'll give me a $400 gift card. Yeah, I have no loyalty to this other company. It's the same service. So I don't want to be that company. And, it was recurring revenue was important. I think, greater than 60 or 70% recurring revenue is important just for having that stable base so I can apply that creativity and strategy that I have rather than having to worry so much about new business coming in. So yeah, those are kind of the criteria that I had, kind of the general criteria. And then I started thinking about industries that were interesting and industries that were growing that I liked, that would be lucrative in California. So that's how I landed on kind of a list. I am specific into specific industries, but there's general criteria that are critical to me that I want to make sure each of these businesses have.
Speaking of which, could you talk about the importance of summarized industry deep dives and how that's helped you?
I think it's really, the concept comes from, what's his name? I think his name's Richard Feynman. Yeah, the physicist, right? So the concept comes from him. I think there's an idea that these complex things or new things they're so intricate that there's no way to explain them simply. I think taking complex ideas or really robust things like understanding an entire industry or each piece of the industry and then narrowing it down to something that you can grasp your head around that's simple to understand. It's one, it takes deep understanding of that thing. And then it's a much better way to think a little more strategically once you're able to digest that information. It's a better way to digest the information. So I figured, look, take these, you've been learning these industries, you've been jotting things down in this document or that document. For each of the industries you care about, do a deep dive. What things matter about this industry? And those are your headers. And then put the most important bullets under that and make them brief in terms of what's important about that thing. If you need to go into more detail, here's a link to the different sources you use. So that really helped me have more conviction in those industries. It's also helped me be more dangerous in terms of the understanding of those industries, and not only personalized messaging to the owners, but my conversations with the owners are much more fruitful because I can talk about the things that I think about within the industry coming from a genuine place. So I think that's really helped me, and it's also helped me understand the importance of simplifying, of taking more complex things and simplifying down so that you can have more conviction in what you're speaking to.
Yeah. Could you talk about where you're at right now in your search, and looking back to where you began, what's like one thing that you would have done differently or would tell other people to do differently?
I'd say, one thing that's really important for search, especially, it's important, self-funded, traditional, but time is your most important asset in general, and definitely in search, definitely as a self-funded searcher, because, you're paying for your lifestyle, you're paying for everything. So it's important to be efficient at what you're doing. So one thing that I would do is do a lot more of that, do a lot more of the work in terms of understanding personally what's important to you, and then two, understanding the business characteristics that are the best fit for not only your skill set, but the best fit for where you want to potentially be for 10 to 20 years from now. And I would spend time understanding that, and then I would be somewhat relentless in making sure I have kind of a rubric for that. And I wouldn't get distracted looking at all of these other deals, because you can always try to bend over and make a deal work if you did this or did that. And I would try to get to know as soon as possible from business owners as well. So I would be a little more upfront about what my criteria is and ask them, does that fit what your business is? And then I try to get a better understanding as to where they're at in the process of potentially selling the business. Is this something that they truly are willing to do? And I would keep track of that. Just because someone's not willing to sell now doesn't mean they won't be in 6 months, but you can't lean on that. And it's important not to, I've spent a lot of time and money going to visit business owners, which have been helpful to just speak and meet with them, but a lot of them aren't ready to sell at this point. And a lot of them, some of the businesses just weren't as great as they seemed on paper. So some of those things you need to learn by just being in person, but I would just say, get your criteria up front. To summarize, get your criteria up front, and then I would say stick to writing down whether does this business check this box, this box, this box. What are my need to haves? What are my kind of like good to have? And then what are like nice additions? And then honestly, I would just score the businesses that you look at, and I would keep it that strict, because that way you can operate efficiently, you can say no quicker, and then you can look at more businesses. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. For business owners interested in talking to you, or other searchers interested in learning from you, where would you like to direct people?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love for people they can email me. I'm not very active on Twitter, but they can email me at John, so JOHN, at redoaktrust.com. So, and they can also find out more about me at redoaktrust.com. where I just list out my criteria, the industries that I'm looking for, a little more about me and my background, but they can always give me a call as well. And my number is directly on the website. So I'm an open book. Anyone can reach out. I'd love to talk to more searchers, operators, investors, business owners. I like talking to anyone and just understanding their journey. I think we're all unique and we all have much we can learn from each other.
Agreed. Well, thanks for sharing some of your insights so far, and best of luck with your acquisition.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, David. This was fun.